I would say, generally speaking, interpreting biblical law is something that Christians aren't great at doing. What do we do with these weird laws that seem so different about, eating lobster and not eating lobster and oxen and all these things that the Israelites were called to do? So Christians have taken some various approaches. Some Christians say, well, we're going to divide the law into civil laws about the government, ceremonial laws about worshiping, and moral laws about right living. And then we're just mostly going to focus on the moral laws. Some say the law was in the Old Testament, so don't worry about it. We're Christians. Some say the law, well, it showed us our sin, but then it's all about grace from here on out. Some say, well, the law is perfectly given by God, and we should institute it into our governments today, minus the ceremonial parts. And all of these approaches have some value, but I think they all miss the mark as well. And so here's the approach which I take from others. The law of God is to be principalized. In other words, God's law is perfect, it's holy, it's good. It never changes. But God changes how he relates to people throughout history because of changing circumstances and developments in salvation history. And I know you believe that because you didn't sacrifice any animals, this last year, right? I don't think you did. Right? We don't do the things that some of the things were done in the Old Testament. Why? Because Christ has come and that changes how we've related to God. And so here's what I would say. Behind every law in the Old Testament is a perfect, good, holy standard from God. Something about his character that never changes. The reason why he gave the law in the first place. A transcendent moral law. Even if the letter of the law no longer applies. For example, in the New Testament, Paul says, don't muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. I can't remember if I didn't do that. Okay, don't muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. You guys can have this vision in your head. They would hook up the oxen with the millstone, and he would go around in a circle, and the millstone would grind up the grain. And here's what those greedy farmers would do. They would muzzle the ox because what would that Mr. Ox do? He'd get a little hungry after a while, take a few steps, he'd get a little hungry again. And so the farmer's like, well, we got a problem here. I'm just going to put a muzzle on the ox, and then he won't eat the food. And God says, that is unjust. Why? Because the one you're making work can't even enjoy the benefits of his labor. I don't care that he's an animal. It's not right. Now, Paul takes that principle. What's the principle? That those who work should reap benefits from their work. And he says this is proof that you should pay missionaries and pastors for their labor. And he says this, it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. And I love this next verse. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Was this only because God really has this deep-seated love for oxen that he wrote this law? I mean, God does love oxen, okay, yeah, there is creation, but it's for all of us. And he says, look at the principle behind the law. Now, Paul then will go on from there to say, I don't want your money, I don't need your money, but it's the principle behind the law. And we even see this in the Old Testament times. The law was not static because the situation could be applied differently with the case law. For example, Ezra. In his day, the people, the Jews, were marrying foreigners who did not follow Israel's faith. And so to address that problem, he says, hey, what does the law say in Deuteronomy 7? Don't marry Canaanites. Well, guess what? They weren't marrying Canaanites. The Canaanites didn't even exist at this point in history. But the truth behind the law remained the same. What was the transcendent moral truth? Don't marry foreigners who've rejected the faith. The principle behind the law was still true. So we have to be so careful when we take laws from the Old Testament and we try to apply them into modern settings. Otherwise, we might use the law wrongly. And that's even true. Sometimes we look at the punishments in the Old Testament and we say, wow, those were brutal. I mean, some of those punishments. But here's what you need to know. Even if the law had a death penalty, or it said an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, it didn't actually mean you would receive that punishment. You could pay money, a ransom, for the punishment you deserved. It didn't necessarily mean that you would die, but instead that you would have to pay the ransom price appropriate for death. There was judges in the towns that help you evaluate how does your law apply and how repentant is this person in this situation. Now, it does seem that some offenses like murder were capital offense. According to Numbers 35:31, you could not accept the ransom for homicide. And the severity of many of the laws had to do with the fact that God was dwelling specially in their land. Many of the punishments were due to God's special presence. One of my favorite laws, because I'm an immature person, God said, hey, when you need to take a number 2, go outside the camp because I don't want to see that or step in it, okay? That's what it says. Read your Bible, okay? But now what's the point? Does God literally walk in their midst? No, the point is I am specially dwelling with you. I'm holy. Don't treat me as common. So what's maybe a modern application? Maybe you shouldn't have your devotional time on the pot, right? God is holy. Okay? Remember who he is. Don't treat God like you treat everything else. God is special. Yes, God is not afraid to become one of us, but let's show him proper respect and reverence.